Hello and welcome to the Subjective Space with me, Sindhu Rajasekaran. We have an award-winning poet today joining us. Jhani, welcome to the Subjective Space. I'm just going to give a quick intro and then we'll jump into the questions. So Jhani Randhawa is a Kenyan Punjabi Anglo-American counterdisciplinary maker, collaborator, and editor. Their work is interested in precarity, queer ecology, diaspora and migration, spiritual activism, and fugue states. Jhani is the recipient of a Yasmin Fellowship from Mille Arts and was named a 2021 finalist for the Pan American Emerging Voices Fellowship. Jhani has taken residence and refuge at the Worm Farm Institute, Upaya Zen Center, Green Gulch Farms Zen Center, and is a 2022 Deborah Ann McNeely Writer-in-Residence at Writers House, Pittsburgh. Their first full-length poetry collection, Time Regime, was selected by Dr. Dorothy Wang as the 2021 Gaudy Boy Poetry Book Prize winner. Congratulations, Jhani. Jhani also corresponds with Cut Cut, an ongoing performative embodiment navigating time, its dismantling, and the feral. They are also a co-founding editor of the experimental arts journal Reviewlet with Tio Rivera Dundas. Also, you're doing a research. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing in London right now? Maybe we'll start with that.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sindhu, for welcoming me into this beautiful space. And I always love being in conversation with you, even though we've only had a few. So joyful to be in that. So yes, I'm currently in London right now at SOAS, University of London, and I'm here doing my master's in postcolonial studies. And studying with Dr. Anandi Rao and a lot of other amazing folks in like the gender studies and migration diaspora worlds. But I think I've been trying to figure out where my research is landing me. And initially I kind of came with the interest of being just immersed in archives and came with a particular project that was looking at archival friendships and archival intimacies. I use that phrase from my friend Aziz Sohail, who is also looking at intimacies and masculine intimacies and queer intimacy in diasporic archives. And Aziz is a curator and is really amazing. So I was looking and thinking about specifically kind of, I guess, queering an archive. I'm interested in talking and hearing your thoughts more about this because I'm still kind of wondering what and how we do that. But
that's what happens with these research programs, right? You go in with an idea and then it sort of transforms into something else, which is what happened with my PhD too. Like what I came in with in the first year is not what I'm writing my thesis about. Like it's just changed so much. What you said about querying the archives is very interesting because that's also what I do, right? Like I'm also sort of digging into the archives, looking for these queer South Asian pasts, and sort of building a retrofuturism, if you will, because I'm obviously looking for what I want and I'm finding it. So you also talk about something called creative refusals. I read that somewhere in context of your research. So can you tell me what that is?
Yeah. Oh, I'm right. I just wrote down retrofuturism because that is really kind of, I think it's really resonant, but I'm thinking about creative refusals and probably throughout the course of this conversation, and already I'm noticing this in myself. I'm feeling very citational, so I'll probably just mention like a bunch of people whose ideas I'm just swimming inside of, and I think I'm making laps, but really all of the work's been done by other people. But creative refusals, I think the kind of genesis of this is also around archives. And I was reading Dr. Anandi Rao, who is my advisor here's an article that she was writing about an unnamed woman translator in Victorian colonial India, who was an Indian woman who was translating Shakespeare's work from Hindi into English, and then from English into Hindi, and the kind of like slippages that happened in that space. But there was another, I'm forgetting their name. I don't think it was Stoller. I think it was someone else. But Anandi referenced another researcher who mentioned staging a death in the archive. Mm-hmm. And I was really fascinated by how a translator might stage their own death or the death of someone whose work they're translating in an archival space. And I really thought about that like as a physical performative act, something really embodied rather than something kind of more theoretical, which I think is what this person was looking at. And so and I'm very interested in the performativity of death, I think, and also dying as a phase change. Dying is something to be meditating on, and I think especially in an ongoing kind of like condition of state violence. I think it's something that I really am curious about, and I'm curious about how we can be. I'm curious about the creative energy, creative acts inside of concepts around dying and like and phase change really kind of more or less. But in the creative refusal part, I was thinking about how to like death is definitely not an end point in a lot of ways. I don't think even with the body itself, like it goes through intense phase changes in and after the death process. But anyway, before I keep going into death, coming back to like creative refusal, I was really thinking specifically about this one archival image of my great grandmother, whose name is Mohinder Kaur, and she was living in pre-partition Punjab, and the apocryphal story is that she either died of malaria or she took her own life. And for my family, that is like a huge question mark. And I've been kind of like sitting with these kinds of portraits of her and like looking at the stories of various women who did decide to take their lives during partition for various reasons, and that's kind of where, in a certain way, I also was really thinking about how does like a self-selective ending or a self-selective like escape route. How can we read that as potentially revolutionary and like potentially creative and specifically around kind of like religious and patriarchal policing. It's problematic.
There are so many things you said right now that I want to dig into, but I'll go backwards, I guess, because what you're looking at, what you mentioned in the end, it's sort of similar to what I'm also looking at in another project I'm working on, which is a history of feminisms in India. And if you see, the British would put a lot of women as saying these women committed sati, but sati was not always like walking into the fire and burning, right? These women also committed suicide, or they killed themselves, or, they took their lives because they thought that a situation they were in was not sort of, it's their choice that they did that also. So how can you look at these sort of, what would you, resistances, and, to look for deeper meaning than just making them a number in something, right? So I've been trying to do that and dig deeper, but it's so hard because where do you find their voices? Where do you find, their thoughts, right? Where in the archives will you find it? Because they're just recording whatever, right? And obviously, if it's way in the past in medieval or ancient times, they're glorified for self-sacrifice. Their voices are completely lost. We don't know why they did it. So this is the sort of stuff. But going back to death, because you mentioned that a lot, I'm an intercaste person, and I have Dalit ancestry too. And one of the things that Dalits have done is they were, they lamented people's deaths. So they would go to people's houses and sing. It's called Opari, where they would sing about the dead, and it's such, and obviously for generations, the fact that my ancestors have done that, I somehow feel like I have that too. Like I feel the pain, like, and I don't run away from that. I don't run away from the idea of it, because to me it's not an end point, like you said. It's a point that, and so it's a loop, time's a loop. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I think about that a lot too. So you speak in your work about disembodied voices and minds
Mm.
and the feral, right? So I was thinking, does that connect to this idea of life and death, and like the fact that the body is gone, but these thoughts, or they just exist in space, and are we sort of like the people who are like sucking that from every, I don't know, like, what do you think, how do you see these things in your work?
Mm, I love hearing about your work always and the resonances. I think it's definitely, I mean, as someone who's a fan of your writing, I also, like, I feel resonance and I
Thank
feel
you.
citational with you as well. So, thank you for your practice, because it's definitely instructive to me. Um, and yeah, thinking about Upari, that's like such a beautiful example, of, I think, maybe that, um, yeah, that kind of like sucking those pieces, and then and putting them into breath, and moving them through the body. Um, I'm it's I don't it's hard to say. I mean, I think that I'm really interested in those I'm interested in those questions, but I don't know if I have like I don't know if there's like a philosophy or belief system necessarily that kind of I'm I'm holding. I just kind of like think I'm just curious and just kind of like arrive with these questions, because in a lot of ways in writing, and I've talked with a few friends about this who have kind of pointed some of these things out. Just thinking a little bit about the intertextuality of our lives, and the kind of like deeply intergenerational, just like like, how do I even put this, just our landscape is so, it's so sedimented, it's such a intertextual space. Everything that we walk around in has just this, like, is inflected with just deep. Sorry, I'm looking around because I'm in London, and I'm like looking out at these bricks, and I'm like, these bricks are made up of sand that has such a life, and like is taken up from shells, and like those shells are from snails that like lived here and were touched by certain like sailors on the Thames, and then they were like compressed by other laborers. And so I just think that there's this like dense materiality of other lives and other stories that are just like so present. And I think it's really beautiful for me to think and consider how porous, we are, and how porous time is, I guess. So like thinking
Yeah.
about it as a loop is like one way of thinking about it. And I think like porosity is another thing that I'm curious about, where like we're maybe pulling, but also like maybe like the dead are able to like whoosh, move through us too. Like, we have
Yeah.
this corporeality that we can like tug, but also there's something else present. Maybe, I don't know. What do you think?
No, that's very interesting, because you've also been in a lot of Zen centers, right? Zen spaces,
Mhm.
and I'm very interested in that too. And you talk a lot about fugue states as well, of the mind and the body, and these sort of, I've been thinking of mind mazes as well, and empty spaces.
Mm.
For me, it's always empty space, the no
Mm.
self, that's sort of like, am I dead, am I alive? Like most of the times I'm like, and Canada makes you feel even like, so every time I'm in Canada, I'm just like, am I alive or dead? Like, because this place is just, as you said, the sediment of the past, right? And being here, hearing these First Nation stories, and because I'm a storyteller, I'm listening to these stories. These trees speak to me. Like I touch the trees, and I
Mm.
feel these trees are so old here. Like some of the trees here are so old, right? And you just stand under them, you touch them, and you just feel safe. You just feel like you're heard. You feel like you're part of the earth.
Mm.
It heals me also, but it also sort of throws up these like existential questions, if you know what I mean. So can you tell me about, let's talk about the fugue states, or like the sort of the quiet no spaces. I would say, like the, where you're in the dark. I don't know. See, this is going to go into very I don't know, no spaces, but I like that. So you can tell me what you think.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just sorry. I'm over here kind of drawing as well as we're talking and taking
Yeah.
notes. Um, it helps me kind of still my mind, but
You are an artist too. You do like performative art, and you like also. Do you also do? Sorry to do I mean, to sort of divert, but do you also draw? Do you also exhibit that?
oh, I have not ever exhibited my drawings. That would be really fun someday if someone ever thought that they were good, like of value. But no, some video work, and I've like done some watercolors for fundraisers and stuff for people. But um, I love to draw, and my dad is an artist and
Mm-hmm.
is like a really amazing illustrator and painter, and so I definitely just feel very like tuned into the doodle and like
Mm-hmm.
how you get into your mind or out of your mind,
Yeah.
into your thought by like moving a hand on a page.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I just drew like a few empty boxes as you were talking, and just thinking about empty space. And yeah, I mean the landscape. And are you in a very flat part of Canada? Sorry, I'm gonna
Um, oh, I'm in
get to
BC. I'm in BC. I'm in
geospatial. Oh,
Vancouver. So obviously there's
okay.
a city, but you can also get out and just go into the rainforest.
Yes,
So it's more
yes.
of the rainforest here.
Okay, okay, cool. Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. It's such an amazing part of
It's
the
very
world.
lush, but it's also empty. If you know, it's sort of empty in the sense of humans, but it's so lush with nature, right? So but it's still empty for me. Like, I don't know. It's confusing.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so it is really existential because we like wonder we begin to think or like realize just like how deep time is beyond yeah, beyond even generations that we can kind of like imagine.
Hmm.
And especially when you're in those kinds of rainforest, oceanic, archipelago, like that kind of like archipelago zone in the
Hmm.
bay up there is so like um
Where did
it
you grow up? Which part? Like, what sort of landscape did you grow up in?
I grew up in a few different kinds of landscapes. I moved around a lot as a kid, but I would say that so I grew up a big part of my life was kind of growing up in like the mountainous woodland areas in the American South, and then also kind of into Tennessee and like some rural landscapes there. Um, but then also like very like terrible in my opinion like terribly suburban like futurist built but like blech Southern California. I
Yeah.
Yeah, but like the lovely kind of and also in Washington as well. So my um I have family and lived for a little bit of time in Washington State, but
Hmm.
also spent time in London and like in the
Hmm.
suburbs around here. So I would say that like the built environment was very much um, that was like very much part of where I kind of grew up. But the South, my family has like a land holding, and we call it the farm out outside of Nashville, Tennessee, and it's really rural, and so that has been just like kind of a central that's like the central kind of site of excavation, I think, for me.
Hmm.
And it's in those kinds of spaces where it's a bit more emptied of human presence or detectable human impact on the landscape. Uh, yeah, sorry, I'm getting
No,
kind of
I know
like
that's
lost in the
okay.
hills.
I'm just, yeah, that's good. I wanted to take you there. So good. I'm glad you're there. So let's talk now about okay, these are the words that I picked up from like reading your stuff, right? dreaming through multiple beings, things like embodiment and queer ecology, because what you just spoke about, taking you to this space, I think that sort of leads into this sort of talk about queer ecology or even spirituality, right? Because I often wonder, does the soul exist in the modern world? Like a lot of people like just pretend like, what the hell, it doesn't exist, or I don't know. People are so I don't done with life. I feel like they're so negative about the whole thing. I don't know. And I can be nihilistic myself, right? Like there are days when I'm super nihilistic, but I think the idea of the soul or something beyond what is sort of we can touch and feel in this reality exists to me, So
Yeah.
tell me about your understanding of queer ecology or like spirituality, all of those things.
Yeah. Oh, I want to ask you more also about like your practice, because I know you also have like a dance practice and kind of like I don't know. I was thinking about Upari and like the movement of this is kind of connected to maybe another question that you sent down the line that I was kind of trying to dig into, and I was looking at the language a little bit around kind of passing, passing or crossing through. Sorry, I'm getting galaxy brained, but I'm interested in, and I've used like these very theoretical terms, right? Like queer ecology or like the fugue state. Those aren't that theoretical, but I guess I'm interested in kind of like beginning to blur these kind of speciest ideas. I think of speciest ideas of the human, and kind of really thinking about how we can. Again, I was talking about as beings we're maybe kind of porous, and so for me, I'm really curious about how the human is a construct, and the human as a construct is porous, and the kind of expected methods of being in relation to space as a human, those are also kind of constructed ideas that are really built on dominance and hierarchy, I think, in a lot of ways, um, and also like stewardship and nurturing, and those are kind of like those are our roles or kind of like functions. So I'm kind of curious about how we can be a little bit more porous in um, thinking about beingness inside of an ecological space, and like thinking about maybe kind of like um, re-inhabiting the built environment um, with these kind of like material ecological histories that blur and that blend and that kind of like mess with our ideas of the builder and the built. And I guess it really is about construction, which makes me think about, that's where like queer really comes in for me, and like where relation shifts, and how expectations of certain roles in relationships are are blurred. And I'm being very vague about that, but I think
You are a poet. I don't blame you. It's okay. You're meant to be vague, so just be vague.
Oh my gosh, it's so vague. I'm trying to be more specific, but it doesn't really work. If you just let me roll off, I will just go vaguer and more vague and more vague.
Yeah,
But I'm
that's
curious
okay.
about your
Yeah,
thoughts about that too,
yeah.
because I know that is something. I definitely know that like queer studies is something that you're
Yeah.
digging deep into. So I would love to
Yeah.
hear your thoughts about this as well.
This is something that I've been thinking about a lot, right? Because I've, according to my research and what I've looked at, like I looked at, if you look at matriarchies, if you look at patriarchies, it's so clear that the patriarchies have done so much damage to the earth, because there is that dominant, that sort of I will take over the earth sort of sentiment just going on in the patriarchal in the structure. It's just so central to it. because that's what it's built on, right? Hierarchy. And so and there is this, you might be interested in this. There is, the Ramayana, and the Sita Rama story and all of that. So Sita has been chiseled into this sort of submissive, self-sacrificing woman trope over the years. And that's not all. The Ramayanas do not tell that story. There are so many other versions of the Ramayanas in which Sita is akin to the earth, or she is wild like the earth. So the point is that you cannot, you cannot control the earth. You cannot make it submissive, because it's wild and it will do what it wants. And in the end, in the story, in these alternate readings, Sita enters the earth because she leaves Rama. She says, you are causing violence and damage to the earth and to people, so I am leaving you. And you suspected me of, you don't think I'm chaste, or, she leaves. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that, in the patriarchy has done that, and obviously it expects men to be a certain way, women to biological return, all of that stuff, right? Because nature is wild. Nature does not say, it's not like the monkeys came up and said, oh, we are the male monkeys and we're the female monkeys. We are saying that. We are saying, oh, and then we get like, suddenly we realize, oh my god, there's so much homosexual activity happening among the monkeys, and we're like, oh my god, they're queer monkeys. I'm like, they were always that to start with. It's like you guys who are like, oh my god, you have what genitals do you have? Like, can we see it? Like, we're just like so obsessed with this. I think it's also a very this sort of wanting to categorize everything, put it in a box, right? And this is also comes up in my archival digging a lot, because there's in the British archives especially, you see how these officers are trying to like put women into a box, right? These are unmarried women, queer women, having sex with other women, and some of them cross-dress, and these people are like, and you know what the British did? They slaughtered all of them as prostitutes, because any woman who's not in a monogamous upper caste marriage is a prostitute. So this is a sort of stuff that's happened to us, like in colonialism. And we've been told, or like, all of that, right? And so for me, the undoing of that right now, how do we undo this damage? Being post-colonial or subjects ourselves, like even if you're trying to decolonize something, you're still within this structure. And how do you decolonize something? And I get into these sort of loops, and I'm like, what the hell am I doing? Like, I'm decolonizing in English.
Right.
And I'm like, what is that? So in my thesis, I have like a whole bit about why I'm doing this in English. I'm like,
Wow.
because
Yeah.
because I'm also bilingual. I speak my language Tamil. So why am I not writing the entire thing in Tamil? Like, why am I writing this in English? Sort of. Anyway, coming back to, I just want to read out something that I had of yours, which I think sort of ties into the same thing, right? About time regime. You write, emergent mutant body intent on interrupting neoliberal imperialism's expectations. And there's a quote from it. 1 minute, where is it? Yeah. I am wandering from Spirit City, where listening was once sacred, silence a power to burrow deep, seeking the origins of sound. I walk by a refraction and become the prism. So those are your words. And this
I
sort
wrote
of is like,
that. Whoa.
so the spirit of a place, the spirits in that place. We were talking about that before. So do you think, I guess my question to you really is, because we live in this sort of colonized world, like, do you think we still have we can still sort of connect with the, I don't want to say pre-colonial, but the spirit of a place, or what was the OG thing, if there ever was an OG thing? So what do you think?
Oh my gosh, it's so funny because I was just I was just writing about this in relation to Walter Mignolo's thoughts on the decolonial gesture,
Mm-hmm.
and Mignolo's thoughts with Catherine Walsh kind of generally, and um, I do like love him, but I also like I have to push against his ideas a lot. Um, but it's funny because um, he writes a lot about the kind of like the mythic, what I think of as a kind of like a centralized spirit of a place before a kind of like mythical ancient, a mythical pre-colonial, um, And I think that is like it's a really romantic and kind of like beautiful space to be imagining into, or at least to kind of like be one part of a seed toward opening an imaginary, like an imagination, an imaginary, um, yeah, into an imaginary that offers us other alternatives or other kinds of realities that think away from colonialism and I think that it's one part of something that needs to be a bit bigger, because I think where the imaginary sits, it sits, I think, very materially with generations before, and especially like into a kind of um, once you kind of get beyond maybe a more traditional understanding of like European colonialism, you realize that there are other kinds of dominance and colonialisms, and like really beautiful. And they maybe weren't called colonialisms. There are other words for this, but um, different kinds of relationships among communities.
Like caste in India, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly,
Mm.
exactly. And I'm curious about um, this idea of like something that like I don't know, kind of like lionizing the pre-colonial. I have questions about it, but I do also kind of wonder about um, just thinking about the quote "wandering from spirit city to spirit city," and thinking about if we also think about time as like time as this big loop, but maybe it's not like a linear loop, is maybe like very kind of, at least for me, I think about it as like very porous and really stretchy and um, kind of these imaginaries become really entangled. Like I don't think that they're like separated in time. And so to think about the spirit of a place as essentially one thing, I don't think that it ever kind of was ever like a one kind of thing, or like one kind of like cultural object.
Yeah.
Um, you know what I mean? I guess,
Yeah.
yeah. But so I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about this
No,
too, especially, yeah.
that's beautifully put, what you just said, right? Because I think of time that way too. It's not linear for me. So, and because of that, I get stuck a lot. So
Oh my
I'm just
gosh.
like, where am I right now? What time period am I
Mm.
in today? Like, because I also do historical research, it's very confusing. And I'm interested in futuristic shit. Like, I'm an engineer. I was trained to be an electronics and communications engineer. So I'm really fucked up in my head. It's like, you have no idea. I just have this, like, I have everything under control persona. But if you came see me in reality, you'd be like, what the fuck is going on with you? So it's really bad. But
No,
I
it's
just
syncretic and wonderful.
I
So
just
good.
wanted to say what you were saying about time, right? Like how it's like, it's all of that. And how you talk about, I think I picked this also up from one of your, something you wrote, dismembered pockets of meditation. I guess
Mm.
that's all we have left. It's like we just have these moments when you just feel like all of these different, I don't know, things make sense through a particular filter, a particular, I don't know, words.
Mm.
Something makes sense. It's also, I think maybe we should talk about time and language, right? Like
Mm.
also it also like how like sometimes what you feel you can't always put into words. It's that feeling. It's all of that. It's that, intensity that you feel in your body, in your mind. I don't know where. It's an intensity. So when you feel that intensity, like what happens with you? Do you put it in words? Do you immediately look for words to understand yourself and that intensity, or how do you meditate? You also meditate, right? So when you're meditating, are you meditating in language, or are you
Mm.
meditating in quiet space?
Mm. Oh my gosh, I love all of that you just said. I'll try to work backwards was the last thing
Yeah.
that you said. Um, it's so interesting, like that the intensity that is felt in the body. I think that's kind of where the meditation at least I think for me is where meditation has lived, is like actually it's really like sensory and like sensate, um, and maybe that's just from, I guess maybe just from like sitting a lot, but um, also there are just like visions that kind of pass, um, and that actually kind of, they feel like they expand inside of my body, and then my, like the kind of limits and perimeters of the body like move outward and distend. And then I don't know, it's very like, it's very spatial, I think. And I think that's kind of how I think about poetry, is like I think about it actually, and people when I say this, they're kind of like, I don't really know it. I don't really know what you mean, but maybe as an engineer, you might appreciate this. But like, I do feel like I feel very much that like uh, I I feel very much that like language is space, and actually even like, yeah, language is space when it happens in the page. uh, the kind of relationships between words become, they become very like structural and spatial. It's very like Calvino, Italo Calvino in my mind. Like, I don't, it's hard for me to describe, but I think that maybe coming back into thinking about the body and how, when one sits and a kind of like experience of beingness falls um, around you, it's actually kind of like moving from inside you and spreading outwards. At least that's kind of like my my thought around it. And then I try to kind of wonder where language sticks to the kind of like walls or fulcrums or hinges, in that space. And like, also, I guess my dad is coming up a lot in this conversation, but my dad's also like, he trained as an architect, and he builds, he's like a carpenter as well, so he builds things a lot. And he his practices, I think, maybe just like are really like watching him work, and like watching him at like the plane, and like um I love my dad, but like watching him kind of like move the wood and shape things. He's really like systematic about it, and would probably be more systematic in thinking about language. But I think for me, it does feel really much, I don't know, there's something about um, the movement of energy through a body, and how it changes the shape. So I'm also curious, because you're a dancer, and I'm curious how like language and dance feel connected, because time and dance feel very, very
I,
densely interwoven
I
too.
think also, especially with like Bharatanatyam, sometimes you're dancing to songs or poems that are like thousand years old, almost,
Yeah.
like sometimes. And you're like trying to sort of, and some of these gestures that have been passed down, it's a dance form that's been passed down, right? So you always have a guru,
Mm-hmm.
and their guru and their guru up before them. And so you always have these gestures and these movements that you're making, which are coded in a particular way for a particular emotion, a particular thought. And then you're like thinking, how does that fit into my present, this moment, this in this queer body? Because also that's the thing, I gave up dancing for a long time, because I was like, I don't want to perform for the male gaze, right? Because dancing as a woman, doing Bharatanatyam, looking the way I look, I just feel like I'm performing for the male gaze, and I stopped. But very recently I sort of took it back, and I'm like, I'm dancing for queer people now. I'm like, look at me. But I'm mainly doing it for that. It's like, I don't even want, yes, that's where I am right now. So it's sort of queering Natyam for me, that
Cool.
I'm doing for myself. So those sorts of things. So for me, that's how it is. But it does also ground me, because what you were saying about when I'm really lost in this mind space of like just like lost in my head, when I physically do something, when I dance, when I do that, I think it grounds me and brings me back to this reality, which is very important for me, because I tend to get lost, like the fugue states that you talk about. I can stare at a wall, trust me, for 24 hours. I can just sit and stare at a wall. It's like, I don't know what that says about me. but I can do that. So it's like the dancing makes me want to, feel the earth, right? Like feel it. So anyway, since we're almost running out of time, and I have one last thing I want to ask you about. This is another quote from something, your essay called Negotiate. This is not something that you wrote, but you quote this. It's in the beginning. If the listener as listener is always prefigurative, can the listener move from the relation of hierarchical enclosure? Can we move towards a gathering in crossing that crosses over? It's a quote from, who is it again? Carson Cole Arthur, I think.
Yeah, and Ken Geyser and a
Yeah.
whole crew of these like really like wow, really bonkers lawyers.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's like these are all lawyers doing this like amazing poetic
Yeah, it's so
listening.
interesting. So tell me about the listener and in crossing that crosses over. I think that sort of would end this well.
Yeah, I was thinking actually really so much about that. That has really, I feel like, come up through a lot of what we've been talking about, and even what you were just sharing about um, these gestures in dance. I will get to the listening part, I promise, but kind of can't help myself from responding. But just thinking about gestures that are really passed down and are emergent from kind of like ancient poetry. And your question earlier about thinking about the spirit of a place or kind of like originary thing. Um, it's so interesting to think about the iterative and also like not to bring Judith Butler in, but like thinking about Judith Butler and thinking about like the way that she is thinking about like the spectral and spectralization as a kind of a I don't know. She's kind of reckoning with like Descartes and thinking about the split. And I think that Ken Geyser and all of the others, and there are a bunch of them, but they're really thinking about that crossing and crossing over and that kind of like co-constitutive, that co-iterative middle space that happens. I guess it does happen. It does happen in a listening space, but something that they're really kind of working toward is actually thinking about like abolitionary listening. And so, if as a listener we're trained to hear for certain signs, and then certain ideologies will kind of like or internalized biases will kind of like emerge forth. That's something that they're thinking about it very like legally and sociologically, and like how it works in a courtroom space. And I do really think that I think it's a really beautiful and interesting kind of like set of proposals that they're inviting, because they're really inviting us to think about how I think really how do I put this, like how the legal really kind of like moderates and structures our relationship to our bodies and the kind of like construct of an other. And something that they're thinking about is, gosh, what is that word that they use? Sorry, I have it up here.
That's okay. I forget words all the time.
Moving from the relation of hierarchical enclosure, can we move towards a gathering in crossing that crosses over? It's like so dense. That whole quote is so dense. I should probably just like try to write a whole thing about that, but
Yeah.
instead I've written a fractal to get
I
toward
guess
it. Yeah.
I guess that's how these things build up, right? Like you write like a tiny piece and then later on you write something else about it. So and you build, but it's beautiful. I think what you said about listening within that space and what this is the thing, right? Like right now, with the sort of state violence that's going on in different parts of the world, and I know you've been very vocal about like Palestine, and you've been doing a lot and thinking about it a lot, and it takes a lot to think about it too, right? Like, because that's the thing, people choose not to think about it. They can just be like, they can pretend it's not happening, but when you choose to actually listen, and you choose to think about it, that's something, and that's political too, right? It's important to be political, I think. Poetry is political. and
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
think so. So anyway, tell me, so I think we can end with maybe you telling me a little bit about that, about all the stuff you've been doing, for Palestine. I know you've been writing and doing a lot of things. So tell me a little about that, and then we can wind down.
Sure. I can do that. Well, it feels actually really important to kind of maybe connect this idea of like evolutionary listening to to witness, and what it means to be in a space of witnessing a genocide, is it's especially the connections between the Palestinian state and the prison industrial complex, just kind of like globally. And I don't know, it's something that I've been, I can't say that I'm doing a lot, but definitely on campus and definitely in London, trying to get very involved with various organizations and societies, and just continuing a kind of conversation with my community here, and being as vocal as possible. I think, um, being as vocal as possible as a kind of like ethics of, not only of witness, but being like uh, very entangled with, especially in the U.S. as like a U.S. citizen, and also as someone who's studying in the U.K., to governments that are deeply involved with like providing so many arms and like methods of imprisonment and also immiseration and violence, to Israel, and like specifically just, I don't know. I feel very much like we are not just witnesses. We are deeply entangled inside of this state apparatus. And so there are a lot of kind of functions that we've been working on specifically around boycott, divestment and sanctions, and kind of working with various workers unions here and student unions here, that are thinking about how, I guess entanglement is just like the idea that I'm thinking about. So like the like environmental and climate crisis is also deeply involved and like imbricated inside of, um, inside of like arms development and arms trading, and also the use of white phosphorus in Palestine, for example. Like the mining of it is like deeply toxic, but then the use of it as well is considered a human rights violation. But it's used in, it's like mined for various things and then used in weaponry, and it's deeply toxic for an environment once it's deployed. So like, and of course oil is like deeply involved in just like securing, like global security for hierarchical,
Yeah,
like
that's the
imperial
whole,
powers.
that's
So
a deep well of oil that we'll have to jump into to talk about. Like that's a
another
deep,
time.
yeah, that's, yeah, for
I could
sure.
go on a diatribe. I'll
Yeah.
continue, but yeah, just
Mm,
entanglement is something I'm thinking
mm,
about, and I
mm.
think, the
It
work
takes a
of
lot. It's
witness.
it's not
Yeah.
just the courage to speak up, especially today in the sort of university systems that are, disempowering people from speaking about these things, right? And all of that. But it's not just the courage which people who are talking about it in the West have, but it's also about, giving that emotional space, because to have to think about these things is to mourn Like that's
Yeah.
the thing, like that keeps coming back to me, right? Because I feel like I mourn because I my ancestors have mourned for generations, and I feel like I understand what it is to mourn a life, and to just make yourself feel that, and to just be like, it's a lot. It takes a lot from this human body, this existence, but to still do that. So I appreciate that, you and all these other people are because consistently doing that, because I can't consistently do that because of the way that I'm built. I never call myself an activist for that reason, because I cannot consistently be active about anything, because I just go into the fugue state. And I'm just a body
Yeah.
lost in time, I guess. So anyhow, yeah, that's. So sorry to bring it down on a downer in the end, but I thought like this is something we must talk about.
No, I'm really
But
happy. Thank you for asking.
yeah,
Sorry to give
but
like such a blabbing answer.
I mean,
It's
like
really
I
good.
said, right? I remember the same thing happened even at the at New York where we met. Like, there was a question that I asked you when you were in the panel, and you said something, and you're like, "Does that?" I'm like, "You're a poet. You're meant to sort of go on tangents. It's okay." I remember saying that to you. Then see, time loops. So, but anyhow, it was lovely talking to you, Jhani, and thank you for speaking to me for all this time. And I think everyone's gonna have, go. I hope everybody reads Jhani's book, Time Regime, which is a lovely collection of poetry. And I think I have to buy it myself, so I'm gonna get you to sign it
Oh, I'll
that I
just
see
send
you
it. I'll
next.
send it to you. Don't you dare buy it. I'll send
No.
you one.
Okay, thank you
Oh,
for joining me.
thank you
All right.
so much. So good to be in your brilliance. Forever inspired. Thank you so much, Sindhu, for your time.
I'm gonna, yeah. Okay.